Hello everyone. Let's start one of the most important components of Kubernetes, which is services. Now, so far, we have not accessed the application anywhere. What did we do? We created pods, we created replica sets, we also created deployments, but we are not able to access the application whatsoever. Now, in the last section, I showed you how to access an application using something called services. So I had a subtle touch base on services in the previous section using kubectl expose command. So that is an interactive way of doing it, but more often than not, we'll be using the declarative model, which is the YAML or manifest file. So you might have already guessed that services are used to expose your application to the outside world. That is the whole and sole purpose of services. Without services, your applications do not have any meaning because no one will be able to access your application. So this is what we did. We created deployment, and the deployment automatically created replica set and launched pods inside of the replica set as per the deployment setup or manifest file. Now, we created multiple objects here, pods, replica sets, and deployments, but we were not able to access the application. So to access that application, we need this service. So what this service does, it actually takes the application and exposes to the outside world. Service is an interface to access the application. It provides an interface for your application. Now, it is not only for the outside world, communication between applications or pods also happen via services. Let's say you have one more deployment with replica set and multiple number of pods, and application inside of this pod wants to talk to this application component. So let's say we have a database here. We have set up a database or a web service, and application in this particular deployment want to call this web service. So that call also happens via service. So service is not only for the outside world, for internal communication also it is used, meaning communication within the cluster by pods. There's one more purpose of services. Let's say you have an external application or database which you have set up on, let's say, either on AWS RDS or Google Cloud SQL or your on-premise database. Now your application needs to access that database. Now to do that also you'll have to create a service, and the service would point to the database which is sitting outside of your Kubernetes cluster. That is also possible. Going forward, there are various types of services, essentially three. The first one is NodePort. NodePort service is used to expose your application to the outside world, to internet. Cluster IP is another type of service which is used for intra-cluster communication. If you create a service of type cluster IP, you'll not be able to access the application outside of your Kubernetes cluster. And finally, we have load balancer. Load balancer is a type of service which is implemented by cloud services. So we'll discuss about it when you talk about the cloud service providers. So let's proceed with NodePort. What is it and how does it help? Now, let's say you have this node with IP address 10.168.1.2. You have a deployment which deploys 4 pods, and the containers are exposing the application on port 80. Now, how do you get this application outside to internet? So that is where you create a service. When creating service using the manifest file, there are three very important configurations that you have to set up. Those three are port, target port, and node port. Now this is for service of type node port. So what is port? Port is nothing but the port on the service, which will be used to map the application in the deployment. So in this case, port would be port 8080. Target port is actually the port which is being exposed by the application in the container. Finally, we have node port. Node port is actually the physical port on the node or on the host. In this case, the host address is 10.168.1.2. So this is how the mapping happens. The physical port 3250 is mapped with the service port 8080, which in turn is mapped with the container or application port 80. So port, target port and node port are in the context of service. Port is for service itself, target port where the service is trying to send the traffic to, and node port is the port of the node. And this is how the mapping is done. Now, in the manifest file, it is quite simpler than deployment. The API version is v1, and of course the kind is service. You already know what metadata is, name and labels, and then we have specifications or spec. Now in spec, the first thing that we mention is the type, which is the type of the service. In this case, it is node port. And then we mention ports. We have target port, which is the port on which the container or the application is exposing itself. Port, which is the port of the service. And the node port is actually the port of the node or the physical port. Then you have selector. Using selector, we select the pods. That's all. So if you see that we do not have any pod template here because the pod template would be mentioned in the deployment. So you do not have to mention any pod template here, but you have to make sure or be very cautious while providing the selector, because the selector has to be the pod selector. Now, using node port, the application can be accessed outside of the cluster as long as the node or the host has a public IP. So how do you access this particular application which you have deployed using the service? You mention the node IP, which is 10.168.1.2 colon the node port 32,500. It will take your request from this port to the service port, and the service will take your request to the actual application or container port. Let's see how it works in multiple node scenarios. So here we have two nodes with IP address 10.168.1.2 and 10.168.1.4. We have this deployment which is spanning across both the nodes. The application is exposed or the container is exposing the application on port 80, and we create the service. So the service port is 8080. Now of course the node port has to be same in both the nodes. So this node would also have a node port of 32,500, and so is this node which has the same port 32,500. So in the service manifest file, the port would be 8080, target port would be 80, and node port would be 32,500. Now how do you access this particular application? Because we have two nodes and we have two public IPs 10.168.1.2 and 10.168.1.4. The interesting part here is that you can come from any one of the nodes. So if you mention 10.168.1.2 colon 32,500 or 10.168.1.4 colon 32,500, it will take you to the service port only. Once the request reaches service port, it will take you to the application port. So how do we access this application? You might have already guessed. Use the node IP colon the node port, and node IP can be any one of the nodes. So in this case, I'm using 10.168.1.2 colon 32,500, which is nothing but the IP address of this node. I could have used 10.168.1.4 also, which is the IP address of this port.